Hello, my name is Mark Dietrich, and I'm the chair of the steering committee of the Alliance for American Rule of Law, a group of lawyers who formerly worked in promoting the rule of law overseas, who are now working to protect and defend the rule of law here in the United States. I'm very pleased to be joined this morning by my colleague Homer Moyer, who we will be discussing all things rule of law, both domestically in the U.S. and internationally. Homer is a longtime Washington lawyer who has worked in private practice in international trade and also worked for the Commerce Department under both Democratic and Republican administrations. But we're mostly interested in speaking to Homer because of his role in establishing the ABA's Central and Eastern European Law Initiative, ABA CEELI, which he co-founded in 1990 to help recruit American lawyers to work as volunteers in Eastern Europe and later in the former Soviet Union to assist those states to become democratic, market economy-based countries. Subsequently, in 2000, Homer established the CEELI Institute, which trains judges and lawyers from around the world on anti-corruption issues, ethics issues, and other substantive issues related to justice and the rule of law. Homer, thank you so much for being here today.
Mark, my pleasure. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. I thought I would start out by talking and asking you about ABA CEELI. As you know, I was an early ABA CEELI liaison, as we were called, and I was stationed in Romania, and then I joined the staff of ABA CEELI in Washington. And I've always wanted to ask you, what was the motivating factor? What got you to start ABA CEELI, and just tell us about its founding days.
The catalyst for CEELI was the fall of the Berlin Wall. That allowed 24 countries and former Soviet republics to flee Soviet control and declare independence. That was an historic, transformational change to the world order that was remarkable. And that prompted a lunch between Sandy Dallenbert and me. Sandy Dallenbert was soon to become the president of the American Bar Association, and at that time I was the chair-elect of the international section. And we had lunch really to discuss how could the American Bar Association help this process that was underway.
And that really kick-started things. What were some of the first early activities, and how did it develop into this longer-term assistance, having lawyers posted into the countries?
Well, we created the idea of a voluntary program. We thought that there would be a need for this given the complexity of the transitions these countries were undertaking. We did not know what kind of interest, if any, there would be on the part of these countries, these new countries. So we asked. We traveled to 6 different countries and talked to the people who were working to create new governments. And what we consistently got back was an enthusiastic, positive response. It was a time when the United States was clearly the gold standard in the world for the rule of law. And it was not that they wanted to copy what America was doing, but they thought they could get great benefit from hearing about our experiences, our insights, steps and missteps. And so it was nonetheless controversial, both within the ABA and the State Department. But after many discussions, we finally got it approved and we created CEELI.
Why was it controversial?
I think from the ABA's point of view, it was abroad, outside the United States, and it was working in what so many people continued to think of as these communist countries. And so the ABA approved with several conditions that included no ABA funding, no offices overseas. The State Department finally agreed. They were nervous, I think, about unleashing all these lawyers on Central Europe and what they would be up to.
Right. As it turned out, CEELI was hugely successful, and at the end of the period that CEELI was at its heyday in terms of posting lawyers in all these countries, it was affecting many countries, and many American lawyers, judges, and other experts spent a lot of time under CEELI's aegis in these countries.
Absolutely. When we started, we had no funding. We had a staff of one in a windowless office in the basement of the ABA. But requests started coming in from these countries very quickly. We got an initial grant from the National Endowment for Democracy for $400,000, which was a huge amount of money to us. And that was followed by consistent support by USAID through the years. CEELI was by no means the only effort underway in the region. There were many, but it proved to be the largest. More than 5,000 American lawyers and judges participated as unpaid volunteers. Hundreds of them agreed to move to the region for a year without pay to be the country coordinators. So it was a huge project. We were active in all 24 of those countries, and it was sustained. CEELI work continued for 17 years, and it was constant. There was someone there. It wasn't a question of a group going in for a few days and then leaving. So it turned out to be the largest pro bono project the American Bar Association had ever undertaken.
Other than the voluntary aspect of it, what were some of the other key aspects of CEELI that you think made it unique and a success?
Well, we had three ground rules. One was that this would be a pro bono project. Volunteers would not be paid, and volunteers were prohibited from engaging in business development activities if they came from law firms. A second ground rule was that we would go only where we were invited. Some organization or the country itself would need to ask and welcome us. And the third was, wherever we went without a U.S. agenda. We were there as a resource to provide comments and expertise and insights, but not to advocate American-style democracy or institutions, but to be there to facilitate this ongoing process. So those were the rules for CEELI. What drove CEELI was the extraordinary response from the American legal community. The numbers speak for themselves, but lawyers were eager to go and participate in this process, reminded many of our founding in our country, asking some of those same basic questions. And it was the volunteers who were the engine of this remarkable project.
Well, as one of those volunteers, I have to thank you for creating the opportunity to go off and do this super interesting work, and work that was transformative, I think, not only to the countries, but to the individuals on both sides who were involved in it. although it was mostly volunteer-based, it didn't come without cost. You mentioned that initial funding came from NED, and then subsequent funding came from USAID.
Correct.
What was the level of political support in the United States for these programs, and what were the challenges that you faced in getting the funding from the U.S. government to support this type of initiative?
Well, there was wonderful bipartisan support for this project in Congress and elsewhere. The rule of law was a consensus bipartisan goal, as was supporting democracies around the world. And so we had wonderful congressional support. Once the funding started and we got underway and got some momentum, the enthusiasm grew and word of the project grew. We kept our heads down for the first year or two, and after about 5 years, we had ABA presidents referring to CEELI as the crown jewel of the American Bar Association.
That's quite a turnaround. Can you also talk about the support that you received from the judiciary in the United States? And no discussion of CEELI can take place without mentioning Sandra Day O'Connor, who was on one of the co-chairs for so long.
Sandra Day O'Connor was our first board member. The American Bar Association said we'll have to manage this project through a special committee. Sandy thought that was not a sufficiently dignified term, so we renamed it the Executive Board. And I called Justice O'Connor, whom I'd met a couple of times, and described the project. And she listened to my 2-minute pitch. And I remember she said, "I think that's something I would like to do." And so wonderful support from the judiciary. Justice O'Connor was on the board. She was a Republican appointee by Reagan. Abner Mikva was one of the most liberal members of the House of Representatives and then counsel to President Clinton. He was on the board. Pat Wald, a very prominent liberal Democratic judge, was alongside Nancy Kassenbaum and Max Kampelman, Ronald Reagan's nuclear arms negotiator. So a wonderful bipartisan board. Justice O'Connor gave us great credibility, as did Max Kampelman, who was known around the world. And so we had terrific support, and we got positive feedback as the project continued. We had several heads of state in these countries come to the United States to give a keynote speech before the American Bar Association's annual meeting, thanking the ABA and American lawyers for what they were doing. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright kindly described CEELI as the most effective voluntary legal assistance project in history. But we got positive feedback throughout. Obviously, not everything was perfect, but it ran well and had an impact. And we actually have some interesting data on that point. Of the 24 countries that fled Soviet control, all at that time had been under totalitarian communist rule. Today, more than 70% of those countries are in the upper half of the global rule of law index. 4 are ranked higher than the United States. 14 of those 24 countries are now members of NATO. Now, CEELI can't take all the credit for any of that, but it's certainly fair to say, as you suggested, that CEELI positively helped change the lives of millions of people, and in the process, changed the lives of quite a number of CEELI volunteers.
Well, I was going to say that I remember in 1999, a major outside evaluation of CEELI was done, commissioned by USAID to look at the impact. And again, the results were very, very positive. And based on kind of I think the personal experience between the liaisons and other experts with their counterparts in each of the countries, and based on the knowledge that we were not there to get rich off of the relationship. But the other impact that the evaluators found that was really interesting to me was they thought that one of the key impacts would be the number of Americans who learned about the rule of law and learned about promoting the rule of law and would become a force for the rule of law and promoting the rule of law globally in the United States once they finished their tour of duty with CEELI. And I think that's turned out to be true.
As reflected in the participation in your alliance.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to one of the reasons why we've created this alliance. One is that under the current administration, there's been a retreat from promoting the rule of law and promoting democracy overseas. The funding for most rule of law, almost all rule of law programming was terminated rather abruptly in January. It's for those of us who've worked in this field for so long now, it was a little bit gut-wrenching to see this decision play out and to see the impact that it had on our friends and partners and advocates for the rule of law overseas. How do you view the situation with the termination of all these projects and the decimation of USAID?
Well, the elimination of USAID has had devastating effects. With respect to rule of law initiatives, democracy building, with respect to medical assistance abroad, humanitarian and emergency circumstances around the world. The fact that across the board, terminations of medical assistance to the world's most needy was just done by the world's wealthiest country should be an embarrassment to all of us.
Well, I think at some point, we don't know when or how, but the work will return, and because it's too important, and the United States is too important a player on the world stage to continue this retreat. What are you seeing in turning domestically to the United States? What are you seeing here as the threats to the rule of law in this country? Under the Alliance for American Rule of Law, we are trying to turn our experience from working overseas and seeing what happens in a country that lacks the rule of law, and we're seeing certain threats in this country. And that's why we're trying to motivate people to speak out in defense of the rule of law in this country. What do you see as the threats and dangers, and what's of concern to you? And in particular, I'd love to hear your thoughts as informed by all your work, both in government, outside of government, at home in the U.S., and internationally. So that's a lot of questions in one. But
Sure. Well, to start by putting it most clinically and in as plain language as possible, what we are obviously seeing is an effort to extend and accumulate extraordinary power in the executive branch of government through a variety of steps, many of which appear to be unconstitutional or unlawful. It will take many, many months for those issues to play out in courts. But this administration has, in its first 6 months, been the subject of some 375 lawsuits challenging the legality of steps that they have taken. That's obviously unprecedented and extraordinary just to describe. Even if some fraction of those are unsuccessful. It's worth noting that many Americans have never personally experienced the absence of the rule of law. We read and we're told and we know about what happens, the brutality and the repression that can happen in totalitarian states. But most of us haven't experienced that. And many Americans, I believe, think, well, that can never happen here. But what we have seen is that it can happen in democratic countries. There have been democratically elected heads of state around the world in formerly democratic countries that have taken steps not unlike the steps being taken here in the United States that thereafter evolved back into authoritarian societies. So I think it's important that we be alert to those warning signs. We're hearing more and more about them and not dismissive of what the possible consequences should be. And the ripple effects of some of the steps that have been taken will take a little time to affect lives around the country, but that will happen.
When we use the term rule of law, and I use the term, and it's in the name of our organization, it's kind of an abstract thing, and a lot of politicians use the term rule of law, and it's the type of thing where it can mean different things to different people. What does the rule of law mean to you, and how would you explain it to our viewers who might not be as deeply involved in this work as you and I are?
This might warrant an entirely separate conversation, but let me give it a shot here. As you note, the rule of law is not a self-defining term. It's not something that one can immediately hear the term and understand what it means. And as a consequence, the term is used by everybody. Even communist countries say, we're all for the rule of law, but what they're talking about is something fundamentally different. After the Berlin Wall came down, we talked a lot about the rule of law. That became a popular term. But what we mostly talked about was the absence of the rule of law. And we understood what that meant. But it was years before serious efforts to define the term affirmatively got underway. And there have been many of those and a lot of good work done. As a result, there's a great variety of definitions of the rule of law, almost all of which require you to stop and take a breath or two as you go along to finish it. I think the shortest way to make a run at that is not really a definition. But if I were limited to one sentence, I would say that the rule of law is the opposite of totalitarian, authoritarian rule. If you let me give you a longer sentence,
Please feel free.
I would say first that the rule of law is a shorthand term. It refers to governments that have a number of features to them. The first and most important of which is that the powers of the government itself are limited. Ultimate power is vested in the people. The laws of the country are the ultimate authority, and the laws apply equally to all persons, including the government itself and government officials. And the laws protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. Courts are independent and apolitical. We have a free press, and official corruption is not tolerated. I would add that all of this and the enforcement, if you will, of all of this depends on an educated and informed public citizenry. We've heard a lot about the decline of civics education in the United States, which is true and which is much more consequential than we have appreciated. And there needs to be a renaissance in that because it is the public. Ben Franklin once said, as the new government was formed, it's up to us.
That leads me to another question, related question, and you and I have talked about this before, about American values and American legal values and norms, and how does that relate to the rule of law? And tell us what people should be thinking about when they think about American values and the rule of law.
I gave you a definition of the rule of law. In a way, that's backwards because, to my way of thinking, because what we're talking about are national values of our country. When our country was formed, key elements were embedded in the Constitution. The limits on powers of government, the separation of powers, the checks and balances, the watchdogs, the free press. And that and other provisions of our founding document really defined our national character. And if you ask the question, what explains the remarkable successes our country has had over the last 2.5 centuries, there are lots of possible answers, but I think the best, most accurate answer may be our national values. And by that, I'm referring to the features of self-government that we committed ourselves to. And it is limited powers of government, and it is checks and balances, and it's robust independence and freedoms for individuals and for the press. And so there's more at stake than just rule of law principles. Rule of law principles really reflect those fundamental values that account for our prosperity and our successes over the last 250 years.
I think that well summarizes where we are at this moment and how we got here. But what do we do next? How do we return to those values? What can we, as we the people, do to protect our values, our historical values, our rule of law values? What are your suggestions in that regard?
Well, first, I think dealing with the torrent of steps that have been taken and are being taken to increase government and executive power, I think it will take some time, both to appreciate the consequences of those measures and then to respond appropriately. Obviously, we the people are the ultimate check and balance, and we have that power through our right to vote. And I think we need both the civic education that has been lagging and an awareness of where this could take us. I don't think that will happen. I think courts will step in on many of these issues. They already are. But ultimately, we're the ones. Your vote, my vote, can't change the world, but collectively, we voters are all powerful in this country. And I think that's where the focus will be, along with quite a daunting burden on U.S. courts and ultimately the Supreme Court.
I was going to go there next to talk a little bit more about the courts because of all the threats that are being made against the judges, and these are sometimes physical threats. There's the whole pizza doxing issue, and this has not just been under this administration. I think Supreme Court justices under prior administrations have been subject to threats and to protests outside their homes and to other more dangerous situations. We're relying on our judges a lot to do difficult work and increasingly dangerous work. And structurally, if we start to lose good people as good judges, we get into even more dangerous territory. Can you speak to the threats against the judges and that specific subject?
That's an ominous warning sign. The fact that judges who are sworn to be neutral and impartial and follow the Constitution, even if some don't, resorting to violence is, we would like to think, unthinkable in our society. It goes hand in hand with the level of gun violence we have in our country. But there are also other unrelated issues that are very important. A country that is committed to the rule of law and democratic principles also must show that it can function responsibly. That requires Congress really to tackle very difficult, complex issues. And it inevitably requires Congress to act in a bipartisan fashion. Compromises have been a part of our history from the founding of our country right through dozens and dozens of difficult, trying times and issues. And we cannot have a Congress that's incapacitated because one party will not talk with the other or deal with the other. That's absolutely essential. And back to my point about managing the economy, it's not just violence and incivility and attacks on judges. It's managing our finances. It's dealing with our ballooning, escalating debt. It's addressing the threat that Social Security and Medicare could go out of business in the next decade. So a rule of law society can collapse because of reasons unrelated to the rule of law. We have both of those challenges. And right now we've got a little of each.
I'd like to finish things up on a less ominous note, perhaps, and a more positive note. And I go back to listening to your comments, just thinking more and more about CEELI and its impacts on the world and what we were able to accomplish in Eastern Europe. former Soviet Union became a harder nut to crack. But bring us home on a more positive, uplifting note about looking forward and how we can build on our positive lessons learned from our work overseas.
Well, I think we have to understand the term, appreciate the potential consequences, and understand that democratic government is not the fastest decision-making government available to mankind. That's the selling point for autocratic governments. We can act quickly. We don't have to worry about opposing views or dissent or the like. But in terms of quality of life, there is no choice. That's a hands-down winner, as today's world confirms. There's lots and lots of talk and reports of downward trends in the rule of law globally, which is simply a count of how many countries have gotten a little better and how many have gotten a little worse. But to return to our original theme, if you look back at the 24 countries of Central and Eastern Europe and what they have done in the last 35 years, it's extraordinary. And some did it much more quickly than that. Some took longer, and some are still working at it. And the surveys tend to point to the one or two exceptions, the handful of exceptions in that region. But there's an important lesson there where we focus on just what the rule of law means, how to build a government and a society that builds in the respect for those values, as we have done in our Constitution. That's what can make a difference. That's what can arrest backsliding in some of these countries that have experienced populist governments and some backsliding. But it takes time and it takes sustained effort, but it's something that we can and will do.
Thank you, Homer, for those insightful comments, and thank you for making the time to talk today, and thank you for all your leadership in the area of strengthening the rule of law, both at home and abroad.
Well, you're very kind. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
One other topic that I wanted to cover with you, Homer, was with the closing of USAID and a lot of the implementing partners also being closed. We have developed a lot of knowledge and experience over the years on how to strengthen and promote the rule of law overseas. And one of the things that troubles me and worries me is that that knowledge and experience is potentially going to be lost when this work does come back. And I feel it will come back. I'm not sure when or under what circumstances, but it will come back. And I think it'll be important for people to know what we did in our era. And can you speak to what we should have done to preserve the record of accomplishment that we have?
Yes, I can. Thanks to two former chairs of the international section of the American Bar Association, Jim Silkenat and Jerry Libby, there is now a record of much of what happened with CEELI getting it started, then with the CEELI Institute and the World Justice Project and the American Bar Association's Global Rule of Law Project. And much of that history is in this book published by the American Bar Association entitled Building the Rule of Law. First-hand accounts from a 30-year global campaign. It is 67 chapters of history written by those with the firsthand experience. And there's a lot of material here, and this book is available from the American Bar Association.
Great, thank you.